That has a feeling that fluctuates backwards and forwards, up and down, from beginning to end. There are some very, very sweet words in it. There are some very, very strong and solemn words in it. And when I first read through this psalm, I had to ask myself the question, what is the most significant thing about the man David in this psalm? And I came to the conclusion that he was a man who had been hurt. You would agree with that, wouldn't you? But then the more I thought about it, I felt, no, you're not putting it quite rightly. Yes, he has been hurt, but he is a man who is still hurting. It's not past. He is hurting, and hurting very, very deeply. And it's clear from the psalm, especially the opening verses, that he is a man who is greatly upset. If you look at verse 2 and then at verse 4, you will see that he says to God, I'm overcome. I am distraught. I am in anguish. Fear, until we go on to verse 5, fear and trembling. You see, he's all shaky. Yes, he's been hurt. Yes, he's hurting. And he's finding it very, very, very difficult to cope. And his first reaction, perhaps his main reaction, is expressed in verse 6. Verse 5 first of all. In verse 5 it speaks of how there is a blackness. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. There is a blackness settling down on his mind, his heart, and his spirit. And his immediate reaction, as he says in verse 6, is to run away. Oh, that I had wings like a dove. Not oh, that I had the wings of a dove, that lovely solo that you sometimes hear people singing, but wings like a dove. And when I thought of that, I thought of how sometimes I'm driving my car and there's a pigeon in the road, and the wretched thing waits till the very last moment, and you're just about going to slam on the brakes, when with a flutter of wings, away it goes. Now, I think that's how David's feeling here. It's all too much for him. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. And as you read through this psalm, you become aware that the cause of David's hurt, and David is not only a man of God, he is a godly man. And the cause of his hurt is not an enemy, not even a critic. The cause of his hurt and his agitation and his misery is not even some sense of sin or failure, although these things can upset greatly and steal from us our peace and our joy and our hope. If you look at verses 12, 13 and 14, you'll see where the hurt is coming from. It's coming from a friend, a trusted and a valued friend. Look what he says. It's not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. Well, what do you expect from enemies? It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me. Then I could hide from him. But it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to hold sweet converse together. Within God's house, we walked in fellowship. That's the person who hurt him, and hurt him so very, very deeply. But it's even more poignant than that, because David is speaking here not just of the neglect of a friend, although that can be hurtful enough. If you look down to verses 20 and 21, you will see that David is speaking of the specific, calculated, deliberate treachery of his closest friend. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smoother than butter. Oh yes, they still went for walks together. They talked about holy things and what a wonderful bond of friendship we have. His speech was smoother than butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil. And the friend was, "Oh, David, don't you worry. We'll get there yet. We'll stand our ground together. We'll serve the Lord, and the Lord will vindicate us. Don't you worry, David. I'm standing with you." And all the time, he was planning treachery against David. And if, as I suggested earlier in the service, the context of this psalm is that of the rebellion of Absalom, David's son. The story is in 2 Samuel chapter 15, it's at verse 12, and then verses 24 to 31. We don't need to read the story, but if that's the situation, then for some considerable time, before David ever became aware of it, this man, this trusted friend, Ahithophel was his name. This man, this friend whom David trusted with confidences with regard to himself and with regard to his work, this man was going to Absalom the rebel and to those who were in league with him to destroy David and David's work, and betraying these confidences. I think it's a terrible sin when someone who is hurting perhaps opens their heart to you and confides in you, and then you go and tell somebody else. That's the circumstances of this psalm. While David was trusting him, this man was playing traitor. And it was the discovery of this that led to David's heart, as it is recorded here in the psalm. And in the psalm we have, as I said at the beginning, what I would call a torrent of mixed emotions. He simply pours out his heart to God. And sometimes from his words spoken to God, it's obviously that his heart is at the forefront. But sometimes in the psalm, it's his anger about the whole situation that is in the forefront. And in the course of this psalm, speaking to God, David says a lot of very extreme things to God. And yes, throughout the psalm, there is a note of judgment. You might even say there's a note of vengeance in the psalm. Say that if you want to say. I'm not going to say that about a man who's hurting as deeply as this man is hurting. But as you read the psalm, as you take time to read it a few times to get the feeling of it, you discover that gradually, through the storm of feelings, David becomes aware of God and of the throne of God. Verse 19. God will give ear and humble them, he who is enthroned from of old. You know, even in the sound of the words, and the sound of words can be as significant as the meaning of the words, there is a feeling of solidity and permanence and dependability. God will give ear. He who is enthroned from of old. And gradually David becomes aware of God and of the throne of God. And in verse 22, of the care of God. And in verse 23, that his God is a God to be trusted, and to be trusted especially when things are confused and when you are hurting. And David says in verse 22, because he has begun to discover it himself, he says to his companions, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. The footnote in the RSV with regard to the beginning of verse 22 suggests we should read, cast what he has given you on the Lord, and he will sustain you. Now, cast, that's not the kind of word you use when you're picking up perhaps some valuable ornament on the mantelpiece to put it on top of the piano. That's a very careful process. This word cast is far more urgent than that. Oh, says David, take it and dump it on God. Maybe you don't like the word dump it on God. Heave it over and onto God. You see, it's a burden. It's not a little thing. This man's not coping. He's feeling the whole thing is crushing him down, crushing the very life out of him. And he says, cast your burden on the Lord, or cast your burden onto God. And that means that God carries the burden and not you. It's a great psalm. But a psalm like this cannot be divided clinically into points for a sermon. It's far too personal and it's far too emotional. But we can trace what this psalm says, first of all about David, then what it says about David's friend, and finally what it says about David's God. Right, what does the psalm tell us about David? When the truth and the hurt and the disappointment of this situation hit David, it really did hit him, David went right to God. That's what he says in verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God. He is praying. And in his praying, he tells God exactly how he is really feeling. I hope you understand me when I say that in this psalm, David is not being spiritual. He's being honest. And he's saying, God, I'm tied in knots. My feelings are all over the place. I don't know what to think. Sometimes I'm angry, sometimes I'm hurt. Sometimes I'm ranting and raving, and other times I'm weeping my heart out. You read it in 2 Samuel chapter 15. Yes, it tells you about this man of God, this godly man, weeping publicly. But he is being absolutely honest with God. And in verses 2, 3, 4, and 5 that we've drawn attention to already, David is really saying to God, it's all too much for me. I'm overcome. I'm distraught. My heart is in anguish. The terrors of death have gripped me. Fear and trembling have come. Horror over. Oh, what a bleakness. What a darkness. And he's saying to God, and this is the point really of the second half of verse 2, They bring trouble upon me. They bring it crashing down upon me. Oh, says David, I'm tottering. I'm right off my balance. Everything is crashing down. And David says, you know, God, I'm in a panic. We don't like admitting that kind of thing even to God. We're apt to praise, oh God, thanks be to God who gives us the victory. That's being spiritual. David's not being spiritual. He said, oh God, look. My feelings are massacred, and I'm hurting to the very depth of my being. And all I can think of doing, verse 6, is to run away. Oh, says David to God, yes, I know your hand is on me. I know you've called me to yourselves. Yes, I know you've blessed me. Yes, I know you've told me about service for me that lies in the future. But Lord, I can't cope. I want to run away. I want to resign. I want to give up. And he seems to have forgotten all God's former deliverances. He seems to have forgotten all God's former victories. He seems to have forgotten all God's promises for the future. It's this beloved friend who has hurt him so deeply. And David seems to have forgotten that there was another friend. His name was Jonathan. Jonathan would never have done that to David. And David knew that. Jonathan, the young man who risked his life to come to David earlier on in the story. David's forgotten that. He's not alone. And David has forgotten the good and mighty men who were with him, men who would gladly die for him. He forgets all that. Yes, he is the king. Yes, he is in God's service, but he's giving it all up. Oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly right away from all of this and all these people and be at rest. Yes, I would wander afar. I would lodge in the wilderness. And when I read all this and thought of all this, as I have done, I know a wee bit about it. When I thought of all this, I came to the conclusion that David's feelings and reactions are all so total that this can only be the work of Satan. David wants to be alone, get away from everybody, in the peace of the wilderness. Oh, you say, yes, preacher, just like the story of Elijah, the great prophet of fire. Remember, after the conflict on Mount Carmel, he ran away into the wilderness. His faithful servant said, I'm coming with you. They said, no, you're not. And Elijah went alone into the wilderness and said, Lord, it is enough. I've had enough. Take my life. You know, this kind of story and this kind of reaction is often repeated. There are people who say, oh, things are hard going. I'm not coping these days. And that's why I've stopped coming to the prayer meeting. That's why I've stopped coming to church. That's the wrong thing to do. That's what David is doing here. David, in a sense, he feels he wants to get away from everybody. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. And if somebody had gone to David at this point, David, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. He'd have snapped their noses off. And David wanted to run away. The trouble with running away is that a change of scene or a change of circumstances and the passing of time don't necessarily solve the problem. Sometimes it does, but very often it doesn't. Because so very, very often the problem is not in our circumstances, but in ourselves. And in these situations that cause us to hurt, there is something to learn so that we can cope better in the future. I look at verses 9, 10, and 11. I find that David is saying there that the whole nation is in chaos. Day and night they go around its walls, and mischief and trouble are within it. There's a breakdown of law and order in society. There's disorder. There are gangs in the streets. Oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. There's fraud on colossal levels in the stock exchange and things like that. Everything is absolutely chaotic. And these brash men and women were deliberately undermining God's work. And David's concern is not just for himself. And that's why he says, God, you deal with this as you did long ago when you confused the intentions of the people who built the Tower of Babel. And so we turn to David's friend. To tell you the truth, I'd rather not turn to David's friend. In verses 12, 13, and 14, then verses 20 and 21. We've read them twice already. I don't want to read these verses again. The faithless friend was one of his own close circle. But could I remind you, as one of the commentators reminded me, that this kind of double-dealing, this kind of treachery, was exactly what David did to Uriah when he stole that faithful, good man's wife from him. David's words were as smooth as butter to Uriah. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? This man was a friend, not an enemy. And this friend did two things. I really don't like talking about it. First of all, he betrayed David. He, as it were, gave to David the Judas kiss. A terrible thing to say, but that's what he did. Of course, in the case of Judas Iscariot in the story of Jesus, Jesus knew all along the line that Judas was a man not to be trusted. The heart of Judas was never with God. The heart of Judas was always with the devil. And Jesus knew that all along. But in the case of this friend of David's, that wasn't obvious, and David trusted that friend. There were things that David would say to that friend that he wouldn't confide to anybody else. And that friend pretended loving loyalty even when he was in the process of betraying David. The second thing that the faithless friend did was this. He went over to the enemy. Now, sometimes God takes away support as this faithful friend was taken away from David, the one-time faithful friend. Sometimes God takes away human support in order to teach us faith and trust. Because it's so easy to trust in someone. And to trust in someone in such a way and to such an extent that we are no longer really trusting God. And when that happens, sometimes God has to take away a friend in order that we might learn to trust. But that is not the case here. This man, Ahithophel, went over to the enemy and gave all David's court secrets and military secrets and personal secrets to the rebellious, perverse Absalom, who was trying to steal the kingdom. Now, it is sore when a friend becomes an enemy, and when that friend now works with those who are the enemy, working against not only David but against the very work of God. The trouble is that you still in your heart feel for that person as a friend, and therefore the heart is deeper. I was looking up the reference in Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, when the emperor was being done to death, and a group of them were doing it so that nobody apparently could get blamed. And the dying emperor said, "You also, Brutus." I think that was sorer than the daggers. And I sat at my desk and thought of that, and found my mind and heart and spirit going right to the story of Jesus in the upper room, when Jesus said, "A man who sits at table with me is going to betray me." It is with great relief that I turn finally to David's God. The whole situation and all the upset and all the hurt led David to prayer. "Give ear to my prayer, O God," says David. "Hide not thyself from my..." "Oh," says David, "God, listen to my prayer, and I'm in a bit of a mess, you know. Reassure me that you really are listening." Verse 16, "I call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan." And God didn't say, "Oh, he's at it again. He's praying like this in the morning. He was praying like this at lunchtime. He's praying again at bedtime." No. God listened. And even if David feels full of complaint and moaning, God listened to him. There are so many lessons here that you could almost preach a series of sermons on this psalm. Look at verse 1 and the first half of verse 2. David knows that he can speak to God. Do you know that? Whatever it is, especially if you're hurting, you can speak to God. And that's exactly what David does. Then if you look at verses 9, 10 and 11, and then down to verse 23, these rather strong verses. First of all, David knows that he can speak to God. In these verses 9 to 11 and there's verse 23, David believes, and in actual fact David knows, that God deals with situations and with people in righteousness. He also knows that God is not always quick to deal with situations. Remember the words in the middle of Psalm number 73. David again was distraught at the obvious success of the wicked. And he was nearly the end of his tether until he went into the house of God. Then when he calmed down and listened to God, he said, "Then I understood their end." Maybe David in that psalm was looking back to that verse as it towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, "Their foot shall slide in due time." I don't want to linger with these stern verses. I'm sure the message tonight from this psalm is for our comfort and our encouragement. Look at verse 17. "Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice." He knows, you see, there's reference to evening and morning all the time. He knows that God is immediately and constantly present to hear, to listen, to care, and to act. And I would emphasize that God is immediately present and constantly present. You don't have to sit down and compose a long airmail letter and hope that it doesn't get delayed in the post. That's not prayer. And it is what David knows that is slowly beginning to control and to deal with what he is feeling. There's sound psychology in that, let alone sound spiritual truth. Was it last Sunday that we sang the hymn, "Not what I am, O Lord, but what thou art"? That alone can give my soul true rest. And it is as David begins to grasp, if you like, to remind himself of what he knows about God, what he knows begins to control what he is feeling. In verse 19, God will give ear and humble them, he who is enthroned from of all. You see, David's son and the rest of the rogues were in the process of stealing away David's throne. But he said, they can't take God's throne from him. He knows that God is enthroned, and that brings him comfort. Because if God is still on the throne, then everything is under control. The government is upon his shoulder. I can't remember, we read so many different scripture references this morning in the course of the sermon. I can't remember if we refer to Ephesians chapter 1 verse 22, where it speaks about how God has made the crucified, risen Jesus Christ head over all in the interest of the church. Look down to verse 22. Because he knows these things, David says, cast your burden on the Lord, or cast what the Lord has given you on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Maybe some of you are thinking of the verse in the New Testament in Corinthians that says that God will not allow us to be tempted more than we are able to bear. And with the temptation he will make the way of escape. And very often the way of escape is not to clear out from circumstances or company. The way of escape is to go right to God. You know, there's not a safer place. And in this verse 22, David knows that God cares. But you know, we forget. He really does care. Yes, because yes, God loves, His name is love, His nature is love, and He loves with an everlasting love. But oh, this is a bonny word. He cares. What's the children's hymn? God who made the earth, the air, the sky, the sea, who gave the light its birth, cares for me. Yes, He cares for you as well, but it's me I'm thinking about just now. Forgive me for being selfish. God who sent His Son to die on Calvary, He, if I lean on Him, will care for me. But notice, David says more than that God cares in this verse 22. He knows that God cares, and he knows that God carries. And at this point, as we indicated earlier, David seems to become aware that not everybody has abandoned him. He's still the king. There are still around him loyal men and women who are waiting for his leadership and for his instruction to do whatever he says. It's almost as if David says, "Oh, I can't wallow in my own self-pity and my own care and concern and in my own heart. There are these people." And he says to them, "Oh, I'm just beginning to realize it myself. This is what you have to do. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved." God cares, and God carries. And David encourages them. Cast your burden. And I don't know what your burden is. But God does. Still remember one day at Broomhill Cross, as I was coming out of a shop, there was a lady, an elderly lady, and she had 2 bags of messages. And in a sense, almost without thinking, I said, can I help? I discovered as we walked a wee bit to her home, just past the traffic light, that she was a Christian. We had a great time together. But that somebody had taken her burden and carried it for her meant so much. Now, it is God. Now think, God, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. It is God who says, "Let me carry your burden." You have it in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. "Cast all your cares upon Him, because He cares for you." He cares about you. It matters to God about you. People sometimes say, "Oh, I couldn't speak to God about that." Why not? If it matters to you, He cares. Oh, what a God. What a God. He cares and He sustains. Forgotten the reference. I meant to look it up. Some of you will know it. "The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." Oh, people sometimes say, "Oh, Mr. Flip, I'm really down. You can't go down through these arms. Cast your burden on the Lord. Look down to the very last verse of the psalm. But I will trust in thee. Told you before about sitting at the bedside of an old relative. She had carried a lot of burden right through her life. Because as they did in these days, her birth certificate was stamped illegitimate. The hurt that ordinary Aberdeen wifey suffered all her days. Her end wasn't far off, and she said to me, turn up my verse. And I did. I knew it. It was Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2. And I read it to her, and she smiled. God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. I will trust in thee. It's a great psalm, isn't it? Never mind the sermon, it's a great psalm. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. Amen, and may God bless to us